This conference will now be recorded.
Yes, we can hear you.
Excellent. Okay. Well, howdy, everybody. My name's Mike Mierzwa. A few of you may have watched some of the original Star Trek episodes. There was an episode there where Captain Kirk was on trial and they read like his bio at the beginning, and eventually he's like, I don't need that read out there. Kaveh, thank you for the introduction, but that was kind of long. I guess that's something that happens when you get a little further in your career after a while. Today I'm going to be talking both about the winter storms and then a lot about the maps that we use to actually help guide basically the state's emergency response to these record-setting storms. In the Chinese zodiac, there's 12 different animals or aspects that they use to describe a year type. I would say that there should be a 13th now in 2023 should be described as the year as the map, because it sure seems like there was no interest in maps before 2023, and then suddenly we had these storms come through, and now everybody's really interested in seeing maps. But if you walk away with one thing today, I hope it is that you now understand what a floodplain manager is. I'm not expecting you to understand that right now, but as I walk through this presentation, you should see it. The first slide I have out here is one of the many pictures where we had some stress. This is a community of Pajaro located it's technically in Monterey County, but on the border of Santa Cruz County on California's coast. In early January, there was enough water coming down the Pajaro River that you can see here in this photo that we had constructed a series of muscle walls, which are like K-rails that you see on a freeway, except for they're plastic on the outside, water's filled in the inside to keep them in place. And literally the K-rails are what we're holding the water and containing it within the channel of that river. Just gives you an idea of how close we were in January to having a flood event located in this riverine system out there, but it was phenomenal. But before we get into the meat of the talk, I want to go through some basics out here, and that is the disaster cycle. There are a series of phases that we always talk about in the floodplain management and risk management world, and there's three. I have 6 boxes here, but it's mitigation, which we will actually prepare decades to literally months before disaster and working. That's what most of us in the flood management world spend our careers doing, is trying to prepare for that next big event. There's the response to disaster. That's when we get a lot of media attention. That's where people are suddenly interested in what's happening out there for a very good reason, because there's a lot of loss associated with extreme events. This happens usually in a period of just days. It could go to weeks in some locations of the world. And this winter we had months of being in an active flood fight across the state of California. And overlapping that, you can begin to move into the recovery phases of your disaster. And the first part of the recovery is what you call these post-disaster assessments. This is where you're going out, looking at the areas that have been impacted by a flood event, collecting that data. And then eventually you get to the actual repair and rehabilitation activities, getting your defense systems rebuilt to get ready for the next system or next storm, going back and protecting whatever assets were damaged during the event. And this can take technically months. FEMA would say it takes 2 to 3 years, but that's their official standard. Usually this recovery period can take decades. And most of you are familiar with Hurricane Katrina came through New Orleans. That city has still not recovered from a massive hurricane that came through in 2005. So it really shows you the emphasis of how important recovery is. And a floodplain manager exists in all 3 phases at the same time. Now, when we're doing this, I said 2023 was the year of the maps. We do maps in mitigation. Long before something comes up, we pull modelers, which I was happy to see there are a lot of us in person here today or virtually, that's our background, talking about what if scenarios and identifying what those assets are and where areas might be flooded. We do a whole nother set of maps during the response. This is where politicians and emergency responders are like, okay, smart guy, come out here and tell me what's going to happen tomorrow. And then we have to give them an answer. So it's a different series of maps come out. And then in recovery, we're actually looking to see what actually happened. Now, as we do that, in these mitigation maps, that first one, these are hypothetical. It's based on so many assumptions, those maps will always be completely wrong, but they're still useful. The response maps represent something that might happen for a very specific event based on near-term data, but they're really hastily produced. So it's just a swag, speculative something guess, right? And then finally, there are the recovery maps. They're observations of what had just happened. And those recovery maps, I believe, is a gap. This is one area where we're not dedicating a lot of resources to going through, but those recovery maps inform our mitigation maps as we come through later to better prepare our skill to identify those assets and values at risk. There's some general mapping rules. First, the number of people involved in preparing a map. The more that increases, the longer it's going to take to complete the map. So during an emergency, you really want to cut off and have a smaller team developing that map. Otherwise, you're going to get caught in a lot of iterations. The information is not going to flow. However, in the mitigation world, you have decades. So actually having that community input is really valuable. The second rule is all maps are conditional, which means that the map is really geared towards a very specific set of conditions to answer a very specific question. We have a tool at the Department of Water Resources we call the best available maps. I didn't like that terminology at first because it implies like there's one map to rule them all, and there isn't. So you'll see that as I go through here today. Mitigation activities, I kind of covered it, but when you get into a flood event, long before the event starts, there's really two things you can do. You can move the water away from people, or you can move people away from the water. That's really one of the fundamental most mitigation activities, and they involve usually a lot of large-scale construction all the way down to land use and zoning activities. Large-scale construction is a lot more interesting. There's groundbreakings, politicians like that, and you're not actually having takings of people. When you start getting into land use, you're taking somebody's land. There's a reason why we might be doing that. It's not as sexy, it's a lot harder, but it's a lot more effective. And FEMA would point out that when you get into the land use and building codes, for every dollar spent in this mitigation area, you will save $12 that you would have spent in a response. But this is an area we don't do a lot of in the United States. Response. When you are in the flood event, now you can only do one thing. You can only keep people away from the water. You're not going to be able to move large amounts of water away from people, but you can get people away from the water. And the slide before I talked here had that picture of Tulare Basin with those cars driving in the water. Please don't ever do that. People have asked me what's my biggest fear during a major flood event, and it's somebody driving. Most of the fatalities we experienced this winter were people in their automobiles passing a barricade thinking that their car would not turn into a boat and that it had like a rudder system or some sort of water engine and that it could fly around and take care of everything, and it didn't. It's really sad when that happens. In recovery, you get into housing, so it really has a specialized set of support services to get into recovery. Flood insurance, which I promote as a floodplain manager, is a quick way to get recovered fast. Most people do not have flood insurance, but if you're in a floodplain, you really need to consider getting it, not necessarily through the National Flood Insurance Program. There are private options out there, but it is the fastest way you're going to get recovered and back on your feet when you have a loss. And then rehabilitation repair can be costly, but there's often opportunities to rethink a project during this phase. Why do you have to build back to what you had before? And you're seeing trends now where we're looking at things that way. So we're going to do a little pop quiz here. Was I going to do it mechanical, or do we want to do the old-fashioned way? Okay, old-fashioned way. Where's the floodplain on this graphic? And I'm going to ask everybody, just kind of interactive here. I can't see the chat, so I'll just make sure everyone on the chat can kind of go through. A, do you think A is in a floodplain? This is in Iowa, where this photo is taken. A, I'm seeing some head nods here. That's kind of a gimme, right? That's kind of an easy one. B, I'm seeing some more head nods. That looks pretty easy out there. C, yeah, people are seeing C. There's water, obviously sitting in that same field out there. D, that's located right there between the B and the head nods. Yes, everyone's in agreement. Yeah, the actual floodway is still part of the floodplain. So that was sort of a little bit of a trick question. E, that little community out there, is that a community sitting in there? It absolutely is. If you were to zoom in like I have on this, you'll see there's some levees protecting the community, and you can actually see in the photograph there the community is at a lower elevation than a lot of the land out there, which is a big dead giveaway that they're living in the floodplain. F, what about on that back side, that land side of the community? I'm seeing some maybes. I said it is too. And there's a clue there. You can look at the fields and you can see actually a natural drainage that's sitting further, what I'll call to the northeast in this photo out there. What about G? I'm seeing some head nods, yes. I actually think it's not. And the reason is again, on the photo, there's a little ridge line out there. And the difference between a floodplain and what's not a floodplain can be very subjective, but usually the land is going to tell you. So if you go through and look at some topographic maps, look at some vegetation maps, and then start looking at some photographs, you're going to actually be able to see where the water has been before. And in some places, the difference between the floodplain and what's not can actually just be a couple feet. So it doesn't always have to be like the deep floodplains that many of us are used to. 10 years ago, the Department of Water Resources partnered with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and 200 different cities in California to produce a report called California's Flood Future. And we had like 5 big like recommendations in there. Within it, we had a key set of vocabulary and terminology, so we'd all be speaking the same language in the flood management community. I don't know if we're necessarily quite there yet, but the document's out there. But what I thought was the most important part of this effort is we did an inventory over all 58 counties here in California and prepared this map book. How many of you have been to Disneyland? Right? Okay, you've been in a floodplain, right? That farm, that is actually built in a floodplain out there. They have good drainage systems, but you've been walking right through it out there. Orange County is actually the county in California that has the greatest extent of floodplains with assets by dollar value that are exposed to flooding out there. Part of it is the property values are pretty high. Part of it is Orange County is pretty freaking flat. But they do have a very active flood management system out there at the county level where they manage that. We went through this map book. We looked at FEMA's floodplain maps, identified the 100 and 500-year floodplains. Those are names that confuse a lot of people. It's basically the small, frequently flooded floodplain, and then the big, every now and then happens floodplain. We looked at all of the events that happened in each county. So for that community, we listed out all of the years that they had a major flood event. We verified that with the locals out there. So we'd be on the same terminology when the next flood. How many times has this happened before? What other maps could we look at? We had the summary where we looked at that 100 and 500-year floodplain and the number of people, the number of farms, crops, species, buildings that were in those floodplains, rolled up that data and statistics. And then we also identified the different types of flood hazards out there, because how you combat a flood depends on the nature of that flood hazard. So what is that? Well, California has 8 different types of floods. I'll read them here. You have tsunami flooding, which can affect the coastal areas. We have engineered structural failure flooding. That's like when a levee or a dam has an issue, and then there's flooding associated with that. Just general coastal flooding that happens now every year during the king tide. It's really a Phrygian tide, but the media likes to call it a king tide. It sounds a lot cooler. The debris flow flooding, which we've had, particularly down in the transverse and coastal ranges here in California. Stormwater flooding, we've had a lot of that, a lot more than people suspect. Slow rise flooding, we really experienced that, and I'll show some examples of that later on down in Tulare Lake. We have flash flooding that particularly hits a lot of our mountainous areas in the state, and then of course alluvial fan flooding. Now in 2023, how many of these different 8 types do you think we had on a number between 0 and 8? You think how many? 6? 7. We didn't have a tsunami, but everything else we all had this year. And each one required a totally different approach. The mapping's different, the response is different, the damage nature is very different. So there's a lot to be learned from that. I just wanted to start that. I'm going to get now into a discussion of the storms that we had this year. I'm going to share the emergency response mapping examples that we did. I'm not going to go through everywhere that the state provided a map. I'm going to go back into that disaster cycle phase because I really want you to know those 3 phases. And then I'm going to talk about, hey, what can we do in mitigation decades to years out to actually assess the flood risk in the state, maybe update that decadal work, and then go through and get into what can we do to reduce the risk out there, the implementation activities. So another quiz we had out there were how many storms, how many atmospheric rivers do we have here in January 2023? Before I walk through the slide here, how many of you knew what an atmospheric river was like 4 years ago? Okay, I'm impressed. There are a lot of hands who knew this 4 years ago. But for those of you who didn't raise your hands, I'm going to go ahead and explain it. It's kind of like a hurricane. We rate atmospheric rivers on a scale of 1 to 5. 1 being like, there's a cloud that's coming through. 2, okay, there's some rain coming through. 3, there's some rain and some pretty big wind. To 4 and 5, which is like, oh my God, there is a lot of rain and a lot of wind. So there's going to be some serious problems. Those 3s are really good for California's water supply. That's where we're getting our drink. That's where we're filling up our reservoirs. The 4s and 5s, that's where we start getting into the flood problems. But a series of 3s, if they're all happening really close together, will cause just as much problem as a 4 or 5 will. And in 2023, we had 9 different atmospheric rivers in 3 weeks, which means every couple days a new system was coming through. We started off actually in late December with an exceptional storm coming through. That's a category 5, and then we had 4 strong and 4 moderate to give us just in January alone those 9 events. In comparison, the 2 previous water years, we only had 3 strong atmospheric rivers combined. So really the storm door opened up this year and tested our system out there. And you're looking at the landfall locations. This particular graphic comes from Scripps Institute. They have some of the best atmospheric river data out there. If you ever want to learn like the keys of how to actually read that and see where the landfall is and to plan, are you going to be traveling that day or not, I'm more than happy to walk you through what they have out there. But over 20 days, we had close to 50 inches of rainfall in some of our mountain areas. That is phenomenal. That's a total that we haven't had in years for the entire water year season. We had it come down in 20 days out there. And Daniel Swain, who has been one of the leads behind a thing called the ARC Storm 2.0, Atmospheric River 2.0, he liked to call this event like a half of an atmospheric river event out there. So it really tested our system out there with these massive precipitation events. So our response, the National Weather Service river forecast locations. There are about 100 official forecast locations now that the Weather Service provides for both California and Nevada. Nearly half of these locations went over a monitor stage, which means we're now concerned about this location over the month of January. These forecasts that they issue really are about to go through and have evacuations and to move emergency responders, things that we call the assets. And so Caltrans, Swiftwater rescue teams, emergency medical technicians, the Air National Guard, all of these groups were coming out of the California OES, Office of Emergency Services, State Operations Center, where I was sitting in the month of January. If any of you evacuated or have a friend who evacuated, I'm probably to blame for that. We were making these little jelly beans a day in advance, looking at what was coming down to make sure that we had people who could rescue people there, and the people who didn't need to be there could be brought out. But that was one of the tools. We ended up setting 8 new records in California during these storm events. And one of the interesting ones is down in Ventura County at Sespe Creek. We had a malfunction, but it was about 70,000 CFS coming down a small creek in Ventura County. The watersheds above there, they had over 16 inches of rainfall in less than a day coming down in Santa Barbara and Ventura counties. So literally the biggest river in California was a stream just outside Fillmore. And if you're ever down there, think about that the next time you look at one of those watersheds. So January 4th, Governor Newsom ended up proclaiming a statewide emergency. And that proclaiming is really important in the emergency response community, is that a governor proclaims an emergency, a president declares an emergency, and it triggers different authorities and responsibilities out there. By Newsom doing this, it stood up the State Operations Center in Rancho Cordova out here. It stood up within the Department of Water Resources, our Flood Operations Center. Public utilities were located at the State Operations Center, talking about how they could basically get crews out there to combat the next wind and have power for everybody. And then the National Guard, Caltrans, and other state entities were all part of this effort. We had FEMA, the Coast Guard, the USGS, NOAA, NASA, the Army Corps of Engineers, the Air Force, all located with us at the State Operations Center, bringing the best and brightest of models and tools they had out there. And in the private sector, we had a couple NGOs. The most notable is the American Red Cross. Something I learned this year is when you do an evacuation, you only count for 1% of the actual evacuated population of actually going to a shelter. So if you evacuate 100,000 people, you're only putting 1,000 beds out there for people to stay in. That means the other 99% are staying with families or friends or going to a hotel somewhere out there. But we were putting up centers all across the state, closing them, moving them around, having emergency responders who have very specialized shelter and care backgrounds out there to take care of those individuals. At DWR in the Weather Service, we were going through and using these forecasts again to preposition material. So we had trucks going out there. We were doing road closures. Sometimes people didn't listen to that. As I said, opening shelters, doing the evacuation orders, and then a lot of coordination calls to make sure that the reservoirs had the capacity to absorb whatever the next wave of the atmospheric river was, because we could see that there was a train of these things coming. By January 14th, just 10 days later, President Biden declared that major disaster, and the code is called DR 4683. what you're looking at here on the screen is a picture of a joint hazard mitigation strategy. This is the plan of attack that the state has to recover that recovery stage of the disaster afterwards. And it actually has great implications if you're dealing with a local agency on how they can get mitigation, future disaster money, if they follow these strategies. In the 4683, we had consequences that were pretty much statewide. The map you're looking at is of the 58 counties. The areas that are in red are what we call an individual assistance category. That means that somebody was evacuated, and that county now is eligible for private citizens to get money from FEMA to cover basically their hotel costs. Pretty amazing. As of August, $54 million just in people like relocated into hotels and things. And usually that's a huge underscore of like what the actual damages were. The IA can include private structures losses, but the amount of money you get for that, like if you lose your house or some associated structure, it's pennies on the dollar. So it's not really worth talking about. Public assistance dollars, which are now the areas that are located in gold in this map, these are actually where a public facility was damaged or lost. I don't have the dollar amount for that. We're still assessing that in our recovery phase. But the types of examples you have is levees, flood walls, dams, sediment basins, jetties, quays, piers in your coastal areas, roads, debris basins. We were filling up Santa Barbara and Ventura County, like literally in one storm, and having the Army Corps go out there and have to actually do the earthwork to clear the debris basin for the next storm. Treatment plants, public facilities. And these are graded A through G, A being the most critical facilities, G being ones that it's an inconvenience if you have to sit in traffic for like 8 hours. But we go through, triage those depending on the severity of the event in those areas. You get more federal dollars to help out that public assistance. We prepared a lot of maps that indicated the Flood Operations Center is what that abbreviation, the FOC, stands for. We had an advanced planning unit that was going through and doing this across the state, and then they were submitting the information to my team located at the State Operations Center, where we were then getting it out to the first responders and having those medical teams and the swiftwater rescue teams pre-positioned. This is an example of the Salinas River. This was from not on January 4th, but on January 10th. It took 6 days for water to come from San Luis Obispo County up into the Monterey County area. And during the January 4th storm, we lost the southern part of California Highway 1. And what most people don't recognize is that Monterey only has really 3 ways in: south from 1, north from 1 / California 156, and then California 68, which takes you from Salinas and back in. And the problem is, the issue is that there's no trauma force center. There's no emergency medical center in Monterey Peninsula. If you have a medical condition in Monterey, you are evacuated to Salinas. And if you have no land means to get from Monterey or Carmel over to Salinas, you could die from a heart attack or what could be something that could otherwise be treated. So we had some discussions about this. We were about to lose Highway 1 at the 56, and we knew that we were going to lose 68. We didn't, but the forecast was showing that the potential was there. We came within inches of those 2 corridors. We had some discussions with the county. The county thought we were okay. And I said, what is it to go through and send a swiftwater rescue team? So we sent some teams down into Salinas under orders to lay low, not to be seen, but to be ready the next day in case they were needed, to establish a land bridge to bring people back and forth if there was an emergency out there. And then we had a Caltrans crew sitting out there on Highway 1 to close the highway to 1 lane each way for emergency vehicles. So we almost had a part of the state that was going to be isolated for about a week. We prepared maps also for Merced, and then Newman and Patterson on the Merced County and Stanislaus border, and I'll show that right here. This is, again, that Newman area, so this is moving across from the Monterey Bay area over through San Benito and into the Stanislaus and Merced County area, where we did have flooding. This map was done in an emergency situation, so this was not something we had before. This is literally my team just on the fly preparing a map in a matter of hours so that we could actually see where the inundation was out there. And there was news coverage about this series of floods that were coming out here too. Some of the things we looked at, we were looking at all of the forecast products coming from the Weather Service. We were looking at those mitigation assessments, those FEMA 100-year maps that were sitting out there, and then DWR's best available map website that I mentioned. I felt like I was kind of in an NCIS TV show because I had an Esri team behind me with the monitor, maybe half the size of one of these big ones in the room, and it was a touch screen, and I had layers of maps that you don't have access to where I could see the facilities that we're not supposed to know about. And my concern was is if there was a facility in a floodway, then I had to send an emergency responder out there to go through and basically evacuate the people from that location because we knew the floodwaters were coming in. What we want to do after these maps is collect whatever data we have from satellite imagery or local observations on the ground to confirm the skill of our ability to produce these maps in emergency. So what do you do after making a splash hit of a monster movie? You make a sequel, right? Exactly. Make a sequel. And what I like about this is when Universal Studios made The Creature from the Black Lagoon, it only took a year for them to realize they had a moneymaker. So they waited a year before they did their next one. Well, Mother Nature beat Hollywood. We had another series of atmospheric rivers that hit us in March. So they didn't wait that long. And with those, it was a slightly different sort of scenario. So now you see this code, this DR4699. So between January and March, the United States had 16 other presidential disaster declarations. That's pretty phenomenal. It means we're kind of a planet on fire right now, or in this case, underwater. But it could be any type of hazard. You've heard what's happening in Hawaii. They already got their DR, and I don't know what number it is. It's probably like 4999 or something like that. But the shift of these storms is different. You can see the map is more towards Southern California, $35 million in individual assistance, so it's evacuation support. And in some cases on the map I have here, Kings and Fresno County didn't have the approval for individual assistance on this. So it's a dated map from April. I think there's a new map where they eventually got it after what we saw coming through with the runoff out there. But in our planning, again, the timeline is Newsom went through and proclaimed an emergency on March 1st. It took a little bit longer for the president to declare a major disaster declaration. So it was April 3rd, so a month this time, because it was a slow rise flooding. This wasn't the flash flooding that we were seeing in January. This was associated with some atmospheric rivers and snowmelt. Cal OES reopened the State Operations Center, and it was now actually supporting two major disaster at the same time, the 4683 and the 4699. And the Flood Operations Center had been open the whole time. And the team that was working there were working 7 days a week, and they finally demobilized in June. The map you're looking at here, it's super hard to see, but this is a screenshot taken from the California-Nevada River Forecast Center. This is an estimate of when you would have peak runoff. And what we're looking at, some of you are like, I don't know where that is, Mike. That's Tulare Lake. So this is a terminal basin in California. This is an area where the water would naturally drain to and not go anywhere else except for into the ground or evaporate. And it's a big agricultural area. It includes Kings County, Tulare County, parts of Fresno County, and a large portion of Kern County. It has 4 major rivers sitting out there. A couple of the smaller ones are shown out here. But we were seeing that the peak flow is going to be in June. That means each day in May, the flow is going to get greater and greater and greater. And it wouldn't be until June that you could begin to see the rivers actually starting to recede a little bit. And that's a problem. That's now an issue where your emergency responders are going to be really tired in response. We prepared more maps. We went into the Tulare Lake Basin and made a series of maps. What you're looking at are 2-dimensional maps that were prepared from a special unit that we call the Tulare Advanced Planning Unit, that we call the TPOW. Sounds like somebody from Star Trek. And as we were going through and doing this, we looked at the water supply forecasts that were produced by another unit in the department to develop these. The lake bed, huge. It has an extensive set of canals, hundreds of miles of channels and levees. No one had developed a model for it. And this all had to be done in a month. So it was a phenomenal task. We had map books, and the image you're seeing of the lake bed out here, everything that's red are those levees or those berms, those center lines that contain the water into a channel. The blue would be basically the most likely, what we call a 90% exceedance forecast. That means 9 out of 10 times you're at least going to have that amount of water sitting out there. The red is what we call a 10% exceedance forecast. That means only 1 out of 10 times you're going to have water more than what you're seeing in there. And what was literally happening is the water in this case was starting to move to the south. But this is a highly managed system too. 3 private companies own the majority of the land in this area, and they have the ability to move water. As I was driving around the state this winter, every pump that I could believe in the East Coast made its way out to California, because that water was like gold to farmers, and they were putting it on their fields so they could actually recharge the groundwater for later use. So they really were kind of heroes. Snowmelt. This is now, again, a screenshot of the National Weather Service forecast points. That red dot that I'm blowing up there is just outside Yosemite National Park. And what you're looking at is what we call a diurnal signal. So this is as the temperatures were getting warmer in the month of May, you can begin to see that we're getting to a flood stage. This is a condition basically where you couldn't get in and out of the national park because the bridge down there, I think it's near El Porto, basically gets inundated and overtopped. And what happens is each day is basically the sun comes out, the snow melts, so the water goes up, and then at night it freezes again. We got really lucky that we had such a freaking cold April and May that we didn't see even higher amounts of water out there. It kind of took it out longer, but this is another sort of product that we look at the state. Here are some examples of maps that we were preparing for the Kern River. I went down to Bakersfield to help Kern Fire and the Kern Sheriff prepare for the snowmelt event. And the first panel I want to talk a little bit about is a land use map. This is a FEMA map. This is something that's done long before a flood comes through. We know it's 100% wrong, and in this case, it's from the 1990s. In the map, if you kind of look to the northeast quadrant out there, there's a big plot of land where you can kind of see the river in blue, and then around the edges of the river, there's this hatched. It looks kind of like red and white or pink or something like that. That is what we call basically the FEMA floodway that we're seeing out there. So FEMA had designated, said this is an area where there's no build on the river out there. The blue on the sides is still the 100-year floodplain, and just to the north of that is this hospital. And we were worried, oh, if we get more than a 100-year flood event, are we going to actually have this hospital, this medical facility and complex inundated? And the map was showing no. So we had to go through and prepare a series of different maps. And we did two of them. We did in map B, a new one, which was done really quickly using new LIDAR data. So this is new topographic data the department had flown and just completed the QA, quality assurance, quality control, literally in December. But in this, we did this new model called the height above nearest drainage. I call it the Minecraft model. For those of you who aren't modelers, if you've ever watched a kid play Minecraft and they start digging little holes out there, lava or water will start flowing to the lower elevations. That's exactly what this model is doing as it works through. So it's really based off the topography, and then it uses a Manning's equation to go through and calculate the amount of flow, and then spreads it up through these cells. In this case, we were seeing some inundations in this Minecraft model, the hand, at this hospital. And so we had to go through now and refine and look, hey, what is that levee looking like on the Kern River? For those of you who have driven around the Sacramento region, levees out here, what, like 10 to 30 feet tall usually? Down in Kern County, 3 feet is a tall levee. And so they had the ability to go through and put some crest and some emergency structures on top of the levee out there and protect the hospital. But this map allowed us to identify that there was an asset that could potentially be exposed, and then have intelligent conversations about what we could do to respond to it. Map C is another map that came out from the Army Corps of Engineers, who operates Isabella Reservoir upstream on the river. So the water was coming from them. So they're kind of partly responsible for what's happening out there. And it took a lot of like pace setting and like, hey, you better get your model out there because we're going to have this hand model hit out. But they did do a HEC riverine analysis system model using the exact same topographic information, same model, same flows, but different answer. And it's because of the computational method that is used in RAS versus the hand. There's pros and cons to both. You'll see that we do show some levee center lines sitting in the Army Corps model in panel C out there. But the point here is no map is right. And you need to have multiple as a floodplain manager and literally walk people through the pros and cons on each and quickly move into a mitigation. What are you going to do about it? I don't believe any of these maps, but here's some things that I think are going to happen. So that's really what I wanted you to see. Going back to disaster cycles, I used maps that were coming out of this assessment pre-mitigation activity, that top green box out there. We prepared two sets of maps using the hand model and the HEC RAS model during the response. And we were lucky. The emergency responders down in Kern County was Kern Fire, and they've had a lot of fires. So they're really skilled at operating drones and actually calculating fire lines. So we have good data exactly where that water in the Kern River went. So we're going to be able to go back and calibrate the models out there and build a new mitigation assessment in addition to a recovery map to show what happened out there so that the next time the Kern River is flowing heavy and mighty, we'll be able to have a more intelligent sort of response. So again, you've seen this slide. During the response, you're really limited in time to keeping people away from the water, but what you learn in the response still has value in that recovery into the mitigation. So it's a cycle. Uses of maps. I've talked a little bit about this. This is where floodplain managers live. Land use planning, zoning. I mean, the best thing you can do is if there's an area that's going to be likely flooded, only use things that are compatible with flooding out there. Farming, ecosystem investments are great things to put into these floodplains. Hospitals, really bad things to put into these floodplains out there. So land use planning. Flood defense system design, when we're coming up their levee heights. From the maps, we can go back and calculate out not just the extent of flooding, but what that height of that water is, so we can actually design something. And then floodway restrictions, I kind of talked about it. We do like to have room in our rivers that's dedicated to move the floodwaters. We don't do it everywhere here in California, but in the future, we'll be doing more of these floodways. California, just for your information, is what we call a 1 foot rise state. So in the floodway fringe, the floodplain fringe on the sides of the floodway, we can build things as long as it doesn't have a 1 foot impact. I would say that's probably not a good policy to have out there in light of climate change. So there's some dialogues that we're going to do on that. Emergency response, I've shown you some of those. And then the flood recovery is really useful in the L word litigation and, of course, in the insurance claims. And what you're also interested in is the depth and duration. How long was that water sitting out there? How long was somebody losing the loss or the functionality of like their fields, their agriculture? But there's no silver bullet, right? Again, each map is going to be a little bit different. FEMA has over 30 different guides on how to build flood maps just for FEMA. I only picked a few of these things here, and I don't like the fact that it's the same picture on each. I'd like to have one that looks like a dam and one that looks like a schoolyard or something like that, but 30 different guides, and everyone wants to have this silver bullet. I'm like, FEMA has literally my entire life been focused on this, and they haven't figured out how to condense this to one manual. Each of these manuals is about 60 pages in length. So, you know, if you need help reading that, that's what my team's there for, is to walk you through that. And when we don't know, we go straight to FEMA and we have access to the headquarters team on it. But it's not easy. When you're going through and doing a FEMA map, the output of that is what we call a flood insurance study. No one reads these, and it's a shame because the first 5 pages actually name the engineering team that developed that map out there. And so you can kind of see, oh, this is the company that was helping FEMA prepare this map. So if you have a question, now I know where I can start going back to find somebody who actually has that system knowledge. They also go through and identify what the purpose of the study was. Were you worried about that big riverine flooding? Were you worried about a flash flooding? Were you worried about an alluvial? Remember those types of hazards out there? They addressed them all in the flood insurance study. So this is like one of these things that when I told FEMA, oh yeah, I was reading these and bringing them up in the emergency, the folks at FEMA are like, oh my God, Mike, we haven't heard that happen in the United States. We've just been putting these on a shelf. No one's looking at them. I'm like, well, they're kind of old. They're all like from the 80s and 90s, but the information is still pretty valid out there. And this one's coming from Butte County. You're looking at out here. So I've been having conversations with them about what's in their studies. Okay. We had a little teaser out there. I was sad that only 6 of us have seen Oppenheimer, but I'm okay if people are seeing Barbie first, but you still have to go and see Oppenheimer. I'm probably the only guy in the United States that wants to see basically White, the movie about Gilbert White. And I'm okay with it being 3 hours or 4 hours. What Oppenheimer was, right, the father of the atomic bomb, Gilbert White is the father of American floodplain management. And in 1942, a lot of people think this is new. This is like so long ago, I can't even think about this. But he actually wrote his Human Adjustments to Flood. He was a geographer by trade. And geography is the study of how humans perceive their physical environment. And one of the tools they use is cartography, map making. So when you get into floodplain management, it really is a science coming from geography. The engineering is how we calculate things. But when you really look into it, it's how we as humans perceive that environment and then work within the confines of what it might do. His quote that's really famous is, floods are an act of God, but flood losses are largely an act of man. And this is so true. It's a lot of times where we actually have losses during a flood, it's because somebody had a brain fart. And it happens, but there's so many things that we can do to avoid flood losses. Where Oppenheimer was rated R because he had sort of a storied life on the backside out there and there was a lot of politics out here, Gilbert White was literally the floodplain management advisor to every president from Roosevelt all the way through Clinton, cross party lines. So he wasn't political in his nature. It was just about the science. Everyone came and trusted him. He is the guy who gave us the National Flood Insurance Act, which is what gave us the National Flood Insurance Program. And he was the one who actually also saw back in the 40s that the US population was going to be moving to the Southwest and the South, and that climate change was going to be happening, and then we're going to have increasing out of control losses out there. So I really encourage you to read through his work. I'd be happy to chat with you more about him. As I said, I would love to see a movie about this guy, but it would probably be rated G, and I don't think it would necessarily get the biggest reviews out there. But he talked about 8 different things that you can go through and do in your mitigation portfolio to address this. You can elevate the land, you can abate the flood, you can have flood protection, you can have emergency measures, you can use structural measures. He talked about the land use itself being something. So back in the 40s, he was talking about the value of land use out there. Relief, this is the emergency response and insurance. It's a way to get into the recovery. And then he defined them out there. So it's old, you're going to be like, oh, that's like an old typewriter. But he didn't mention the word flood control once. So Gilbert White recognized that you can't control floods, but you can mitigate basically the losses associated with them. So I just wanted to leave it here is that, well, we do a lot in the mapping and identification where the risks are. The real conversation and where we really have the ability is to take those maps and to think about these 8 classes of human adjustments and how we can go through and have a lifestyle that is compatible with periodic flooding. The answer's been there literally for generations out there, and I'm looking upon you as leaders in the environmental water fields to actually be sort of those clerics, the choir going out there and talking about what you know should be done. So with that, I'll be open to any questions.
Let's turn off the recording. Questions here. Thank you, Mike.